Wanted to introduce our panel today for human trafficking. To my left here is Dr. John Martin, who is Director of Human Trafficking in State Courts. For the past 40 years, he's consulted with courts, justice, and human service agencies. He's conducted research and taught various seminars. Next to John is Katie Crank. Katie is the coordinator of domestic violence programs at the Center for Court Innovations. She provides technical assistance to courts and community stakeholders on domestic violence and sexual assault and trafficking. She's worked with domestic violence shelters and legal aid organizations in Ghana, Indiana, Missouri, and Illinois. Next to Katie is Jonathan Mattiello. He is the director of the State Justice Institute. Before joining SJI, he served with the U.S. Department of Justice as a budget analyst. He also served as a program analyst for the U.S. DEA and is a recipient of numerous awards. Too many to recite here. Okay, and next to Jonathan is Peter Coolsen. Peter Coolsen is a court administrator for the Criminal Division Circuit Court in Chicago. He's an ICM fellow, former NACM board member, and co-editor, he's going off, of the Court Express. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
All right, thank you. You can see our impressive slides and our impressive electronic version. Did you all get this in the mail? Does this look familiar? Okay. That's really what we're going to be talking about today, and we had this beautiful electronic version that we're going to show the links and all that kind of stuff, and we got here 5 minutes ago and none of it works, apparently. We can't, it all works on here, but it won't make the connection from here up to here. So we're performing once again without a net. Looking around this audience, I know none of you have ever had to do that before, but we'll be fine. So really what we want to do today, I've got my little cheater notes. We want to introduce the guide to human trafficking in the state courts. We're going to start with Jonathan Mattiello is going to give you a little bit about the State Justice Institute's interest in human trafficking and the state courts. And why they got interested and what that really means for courts generally. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the contents of the guide, the audience, and give you some general sense of what's in it and what we had in mind when we were working with the NACM committee and other groups to give you this resource. I'm disappointed because the electronic version, let's face it, this thing is really pretty. And you got to have pretty these days, and you've got to have it all in one place and so forth. But the actual juice is going to come from the electronic version where you're able to skip around and make all the links, the hypertext links within the document. I'm feeling more confident. And all the things we can do electronically. But if we can't demonstrate some of those today, we'll survive. Okay, so that's our whole. That's our whole game plan. And Jonathan, why don't you do your piece here, and then I'll pick it up. Yeah, just put up the slides and the other one.
Is this microphone on? No? Okay.
All right, and we also are doing a web streaming kind of thing, so all you folks in wherever you are, we got a good crowd here, and we're trying to make everything work. All right, so take it away, Jonathan.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Just a little brief background on SJI. We are a quasi-federal agency. We have 11-member board of directors made up of state chief justices, state court judges, and a court administrator, and we award grants to state courts. And we try to focus on two things. One is being responsive to the current needs of the state courts through our competitive grant program, but also trying to take a look out into the future on trends. Should I step up here? No, is this working? Okay, all right. Sorry. Okay, all right. Sorry about that. But also looking out into the future on trends, what are the key challenges that state courts are going to be facing that we're seeing in the future from talking to the experts in the field? Some of the examples, of course, have been immigration issues, and we focused on that for well over 6 years now. But also this past fiscal year, focusing on human trafficking and
how the state courts can play a role in identifying and assisting victims of human trafficking. Most federal and state laws, and now all 50 states have laws on human trafficking, have a lot of emphasis on law enforcement and prosecution with really very minimal to none focus for the state courts. So we're really trying to address that gap. For example, state court judges can play a significant role in both identifying victims and helping them with protective visas in certain cases. But again, our state courts, as you all well know, lack the basic education, the infrastructure to deal with this issue. A big part of our human trafficking efforts over this past year have been the basic education of what is human trafficking and how do you identify victims. Last fiscal year, we designated human trafficking as a priority investment area for our grant funding. We put out a special request for proposals to see what we would get. Well, what organizations are out there that have the expertise on human trafficking? And we got responses from several court support organizations, the Center for Public Policy Studies, which is John's group, the Center for Court Innovation, with Katie's group, and also the National Judicial College. And we took a look at the different work that they're doing and said, this is great. This is the type of innovative projects that we want to fund, but we don't want to do it in a silo. Let's bring these groups together to work together in a collaborative effort to try to get this information out to the state courts and to be a resource together, as opposed to courts contacting NJC directly for one thing and CCI for another. So we established the Human Trafficking and the State Courts Collaborative, which consists of these organizations and also the National Association of Women Judges, Legal Momentum out of New York City, and also here recently the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. So we feel we have a very strong collaborative that works together, communicates, shares information, and again, they played a huge role in writing the NACM guide that you all have seen. Again, the collaborative has established hdcourts.org as the main website for all the education, the latest events, the technical assistance that's available. Again, the NACM guide as well. We've recently committed to another round of funding for the collaborative for this fiscal year. So if you feel that you need some help in your courts, please contact either me or any member of the collaborative. The good news is that if there's certain areas that you need help with, I think we've got enough expertise and coverage that we'll be able to find some assistance for you. Again, our goal really not only is to support the state courts with human trafficking and looking at these issues that are around the corner, but we hope that with our initial seed funding that the state courts will make human trafficking really a part of day-to-day operations, that identifying victims is just part of what you do, whether it's self-help or language access, that it becomes something that's ingrained into your court culture. So I encourage you to use us as a resource, and feel free to give us a call if you have any questions. But thank you.
All right, thanks. Okay. Let me, when we talk about human trafficking, the scope of the initiative, can that guy still see me there? You're following me? I'm trying to get out of the light. When we talk about human trafficking, we're going to put up a definition here in a minute, but the scope of what we're looking at encompasses sex trafficking, okay, labor trafficking. It encompasses adults and children, foreign nationals, and United States citizens, okay? And those are important, as you'll see, and as you probably noticed when you look through pieces of the guide. So we cast the net broadly. The purpose of the guide is to do 5 things. 1, we want to clarify the types, dynamics, and how human trafficking is going to appear in various cases throughout your case types in your court. Most of you, when you think of human trafficking, what kind of cases immediately come to mind? Where do you think you might see human trafficking, even before we throw the definition up? Prostitution. All right, so the most obvious one is prostitution. Very common. All right, but where are some other things that you might suspect you may see things appear on other parts of your caseload? All right, prostitution is one, it's an obvious one. But what often accompanies prostitution? Drugs, and especially when we now are dealing with coerced people who part of the time they're coerced to perform acts of prostitution, but part of the time they're also coerced to sell drugs or distribute drugs or so forth. See how this starts to weave together? Have any of you experienced peddling rings? Somehow we get all these calls now from the local Goldwaters or whatever, and why were there all these kids from Monaco or Morocco or Afghanistan suddenly being picked up on shoplifting charges? Some of you probably have experienced this. Well, it's not just by chance. It's because kids are essentially enslaved to be part of rings that do systematic, organized shoplifting. So one of the things that the guidebook does, and I can't go into all the details, but it lays out for all your different case types and all your different matters, okay? Not just your case types, but what happens when people are asked to issue arrest warrants or these kinds of things. How all of that, there may be trafficking involved elements there that you're not aware of now, but they may be present. So we try to go through and identify different ways that you're going to be able to see human trafficking. The second thing that we talk about are the techniques and tools for not only identifying traffickers and trafficking victims, but for begin to realize what you have to do to work with your justice partners and others to address the issues. What kinds of services might be available? What kinds of services and protections might be available for immigrant trafficking victims as opposed to U.S. citizens, as opposed to children and so forth? So we try and lay out all those kinds of things. And then a fourth thing that we try to do is work very carefully with, often now we're addressing human trafficking as part of broader community-wide efforts. And some of the things that Ernie was talking about yesterday about this whole notion of collaboration, all these different levels and layers of collaboration. In the human trafficking arena, every major metropolitan area, every state in the country has some kind of broader anti-human trafficking effort. And there's a lot of materials in there to help you not only understand where people are coming from on those broader efforts, so that you all can also be better participants in it, so that you understand what public health approaches to human trafficking are and what those might mean for your courts. So you understand when labor organizations get involved, the perspective that they're coming from and what that might mean to the courts and so forth. Okay, so we're still messing with this? Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope of human trafficking in the United States. I had a very nice definition here, and at some point that will show up. Oh, fantastic. So take a look at this definition. This is every one of your states now has human trafficking statutes that are going to be closely following the general concepts that are outlined here. There's differences in the statutes themselves, but this is basically what they're getting at, and this is based on the federal piece. So the whole point here is that when an individual or organization is induced, recruited, harbored, transported by force, fraud, variety of different forms of coercion for the purposes of, and there's lots of commercial sex acts. You know, we think of pimp-controlled prostitution, but sitting here in this city, Phoenix, Craigslist, Backpage, and so forth, that's the primary vehicle for a lot of the sex trafficking that occurs here. It's not going to occur out on the street anymore. It's going to be much more based on other ways for people to be hooked up. All right, and a lot of that, it was somebody setting up their back page themselves. Well, now traffickers have figured all that out, and they've taken over a lot of that business and forced people then to work for them. All right, so the techniques, the forms, the intersections between the legal sex trade and the illegal sex trade, all that stuff is covered in the guide, because that all gets pretty complicated, right? About, well, I'm a dancer at a club, but then somehow I start to get involved in prostitution that's controlled by other people. The other thing I want to emphasize here, that for children there is no commercial. All prostitution in every one of your states involving children is by definition human trafficking. There's no longer that distinction. All right? Now, depending on your state, there's lots of different permutations about what that means later on for juvenile records and so forth and so on, and some of that is laid out in the guide. Now, labor trafficking, the numbers here, let's just go through those. In the United States, at any one moment, there's somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people that are being trafficked. Okay, we don't have great numbers. Roughly, in a 15 to, in a low year, the last 10 years, between 15 and 60,000 people are trafficked in the United States every year for labor or sex purposes. A lot more people, though, in the sex arena in particular, are not foreign nationals. All right, in the sex arena, just to think of it generally, in the sex arena, the majority of trafficking victims, likely in the United States today, are not foreign nationals. In the labor trafficking arena, it's the exact opposite. Okay? In the labor trafficking arena, there's lots of things around different industries. Fishing industries are notorious. Some forms of agriculture. I was just talking to our person introducing us from Merced, California. They're certainly discovering all kinds of things going on there. So the numbers are staggering. Human trafficking worldwide is a $35 billion a year industry. Just behind drugs is the biggest, the next largest criminal enterprise. Probably 20 million people involved. All that is documented in the guide itself. All right, last couple of things I want to say. The contents of the guide there's 11 chapters, and they range from everything from the ethics for court administrators and judges about what they can do and not do as part of these community-wide efforts, but even more so what they can do and not do from the bench, all these kinds of things. It ranges from that kind of thing to all the general informational pieces about the various forms and dynamics of human trafficking. Yeah, you can just go to the contents page there. Thank you. And you can see it's I don't have time to do all the hypertext links, but you can see we're talking about a pretty healthy range of topics here. Each chapter is structured so that it starts by describing the topic in some detail. So the immigration chapter would describe why trafficking is a problem among immigrant communities, what that means for you as a court. That's the second part. Why should you care as a court? Then what it really means for your case processing, and then it gives you some examples of tools and things that you can use to begin to address some of these issues, and then it provides you an awful lot of links to other resources. That's the great advantage of an electronic version, because we can get you out to all those references, all the worksheets, all the things that are out in the world that you're able to use and access. All right, and you can see our topic list. You can go up a little bit. Ranges from everything from, like I say, ethical issues to child sex trafficking victims to the Affordable Care Act, which Peter helped us put together, tribal justice. This one was a horror story, the complexities of language, culture, and the dynamics of human trafficking, an ongoing saga, and then this whole thing about educational resources for judges and others. So we tried to do a pretty comprehensive job. We had a great group of authors. Most of you have got this version now, and I'm just going to leave it there. So the electronic version we're beta testing now will be on the next couple of weeks, and we hope that'll be useful to you. So that's kind of basically what we were thinking of. I don't have much time to really talk about it, but I think that gives you a sense of what we were trying to do with it. The feedback we've gotten so far is very, very positive, but, very positive, and part of that positive response is I had no idea. When I really start to get into the details, I start to see this in ways that I hadn't before. And that's a good thing. But we didn't want you just left with, geez, wow, this is a big problem. We wanted to be able to provide you things that can really help you effectively address it in your caseload, but also as a leader in a community as communities begin to address human trafficking. Okay? Didn't do too bad on time. For me, I did a miracle on time. So.
So beyond the sort of broad overview of the purpose behind this guide and this collaborative and what all is contained in this guide, I wanted to go a little more in depth and give you an example of what some of the types of skills and pieces of this guide really focus on. So the first thing I want to do is talk about identifying trafficking involved cases. So most of you said, prostitution, that's a great place to start in terms of identifying trafficking involved cases, but especially when it comes to sex trafficking, although this is true in many cases in labor trafficking as well, there may be other related case types in which you're actually seeing victims of trafficking in your courtrooms. So just to give you some examples, in sex trafficking and prostitution, oftentimes it's pimp-controlled prostitution. And so many of us are familiar with the dynamics of domestic violence, which have a lot to do with power and control and can involve a lot of different tactics in terms of beyond just physical abuse, really using emotional manipulation and other tactics within an intimate relationship to exert that power and control. Well, in the sex trafficking and pimp-controlled prostitution arenas, we really see some of the same things. And just to give you an example, one area that may be used as a tactic of control is substance use. So sometimes using drugs can be a way that a pimp really exerts control. They force someone to start using substances if they weren't using them before. On the other hand, substance use can also be a form of coping with the daily reality of being in not in control of one's own self and one's own body, and to really try and block out what, terrible things may be done to them as part of a pimp-controlled prostitution. So even in drug cases, this substance use issue, since it's so intertwined with sex trafficking, you may even be seeing in some of your drug court cases, if you have a drug court, that some of these defendants, especially if they're women or in some cases transgender defendants, they may be good candidates for further screening and really taking a closer look. John also touched on children, and they're definitely a huge vulnerable population, and oftentimes they're who we think of first when we think of sex trafficking, because you hear a lot in the news about children who've been victimized, and certainly they are a population that is very at risk. But thinking too a little outside the box in terms of where you might be seeing those kids. So maybe they aren't appearing as kind of the perfect victim as you might think of them, like showing signs of, maybe they were picked up in a police raid and it's very clear that they were sex trafficking victims. Maybe instead they're in the juvenile delinquency system. They're involved with child welfare. A lot of times, group homes, delinquency centers, there's like different areas where actually pimps will go to recruit. So juvenile detention centers are a big example. But thinking about whether there are cases where maybe you have a child who's experienced homelessness or has truancy issues, they may actually be another good candidate for screening and looking further into whether there may be trafficking or victimization involved there. So identifying is a big issue, and we address that actually in Chapter 5 of the guide. So there's an entire chapter that focuses just on what are some of the initial beginning considerations when you're thinking about how to identify whether someone's experienced trafficking. That chapter really focuses on it. And a lot of times there's not as much that's developed in this field that's really like an evidence-based tool that we can just hand to you. I think the field will get there. But right now, it's more about incorporating trafficking-specific questions into existing tools. And there are a couple of efforts that we've seen, and there's an example from New York, which is where the Center for Court Innovation is based, where they've taken a tool and really plugged those questions in and made it part of the conversation that a social worker is having with those defendants who are coming through certain specialized courts. So I think that's a big piece that people are asking about, that people are curious about, how can we help people if we haven't yet identified them? So we wanted to address that in the guide and hope that that will be just really the beginning of a conversation on how you identify those cases. I think too that, you know, considering how trafficking might appear just in a variety of case types, another thing to think about, and which I think we cover a fair bit in this guide, is how victims might appear. You know, so they're really the presentation of the victim. Think about recidivism in a little bit of a different light. So a lot of times what we've done is tried to start small in some of our jurisdictions in New York and elsewhere when they're first starting out trying to identify these cases. So for example, starting with women in the drug court, I mentioned that earlier as an example. You know, how can we look at some of their recidivism, look at some of their behaviors, and try and identify whether that might actually be a symptom or a consequence of being a trafficking victim versus an intentional effort to try and be, you know, a difficult person, or to try and not work with the judge or not work with the court. It may be that that person doesn't have control over their actions, and they don't have control over, you know, the crime for which they were arrested, loitering or prostitution or any of those types of things. So really we're trying to think and reshape our thinking about recidivism, because it may not be the best measure for this population of success. It may instead be more about what that victim's experience has been, identifying them as a victim in the first instance, figuring out what that experience has been for them, and responding with appropriate services that may help them leave the life and thus hopefully not cycle back through the court again and again. So that actually leads a little bit into the victim-defendant dynamic in sex trafficking. And really this is, you know, a unique opportunity to think about the ways in which we view defendants in the courtroom. There's, of course, you know, a lot of research on trauma and procedural justice, and, you know, a lot of us have seen that before. But in this context, especially when you're thinking about sex trafficking, you really want to think of how in your court could you provide supports that would help this person, well, that again would first identify whether they've been victimized, and then help this person to leave the life, or at least, if not leave the life, find safety, and hopefully, you know, down the road they might be able to break free of that sort of trafficking or prostitution situation. So, and two, I always like to make the link between, again, you know, a lot of people focus on young children, which they're very vulnerable, and certainly that's an important piece to talk about in the trafficking arena. But oftentimes adults who we're seeing that are coming through on prostitution charges or other types of charges may have entered into the life as a child. So oftentimes, just because you're seeing someone in court who's an adult, and you know, maybe they're not as sympathetic of a defendant because you think, you know, they should have the ability to make different choices and not, you know, continue in the life. Think about the fact that they may actually have a very long history of trauma. And we do see that a lot, that especially adults who've been childhood victims of sexual abuse are, I think it's something in the range of 28 times more likely to enter into the life or to have a pimp-controlled prostitution experience as an adult. So that's a huge statistic. It's a huge risk factor. So just making that link between the adult population that you see versus working with children. And I think, too, that it's really important to remember, you know, rather than viewing defendants simply through the lens of their crime, think about the shame and stigma that comes with being a victim of prostitution or sex trafficking. So, you know, truly that is a crime that many of us, or at least, you know, those around us who may be less educated about this issue, think of as, you know, a really deplorable crime. And so victims who've been coerced into that certainly feel that from society. So going into a courtroom, having this victimization or this trauma in their past or present can really impact the way that they present. They may be less likely to trust systems, to trust someone who's trying to intervene, because in the past, those have been the systems or the society that has judged them. So I think really thinking about in sex trafficking in particular, how that shame and stigma can play a really big role in how they're presenting. And then briefly, I wanted to just point out that we do have in the guide, and this is in chapter 2 for those of you that have the hard copy, but again, we'll have the electronic copy available for anyone who'd prefer to read it that way. But chapter 2 really focuses on a few different examples of how courts around the country have been addressing this issue. So there's a couple of examples from New York. New York is one of the first states that implemented a statewide initiative to have these specialized human trafficking intervention courts. So a couple of our examples come from that setting just because it's more of a coordinated example, easy to point to. But there's one in Queens, New York, and they actually look at the overlap of the drug court, mental health court, and the human trafficking intervention court, which they used to call their prostitution diversion court. So that's for many of the reasons that I just described, because they were seeing that female and transgender defendants in drug court and mental health court were much more likely to have a past history of domestic violence, sexual assault, and possibly even trafficking, all of which kind of fall under this umbrella of trauma. They started to screen that population specifically and link them to services in the community. So that's one model that really tried to, and they still are currently, trying to bring together several problem-solving courts to really screen more comprehensively for trafficking where it might exist. There's another model based out of Midtown Manhattan, which, in the past, Times Square is a very different place now, but in the past there was a lot of street prostitution there. As John mentioned, a lot of times now it's more online. It may not look exactly like it used to, but that court was came from that history of street prostitution being such a big issue in Times Square. But they've really done a lot of hard work to develop their model within a community court. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with community courts or if any of you have a community court, but they typically focus on very low-level crimes and provide alternatives to incarceration, like many of us are familiar with. But they really brought prostitution as an issue that needed to be addressed within that already specialized community court. They wanted to have an even more specific response to this issue. And then we've also seen, and you can see this in the chapter, but we've also seen examples of prosecutor-led responses. And I would just say, too, that sometimes that may not seem as relevant if you're coming from the court perspective, but really the prosecutor-led response or a police-led response really rely on the court to be fully implemented. So there's an example in Portland, Oregon of a prosecutor-led response, and really they rely on the court very heavily to do the compliance piece. So they link defendants to trauma-informed services, but then rely on the court to be the one that responds if a woman is not showing up. The court intervenes right away to say, to make sure that that woman is safe, that she didn't return to the life. So it's not a punitive role, but it's a really good partnership to focus on safety and hopefully helping these women leave the life. So, and then just very briefly, I wanted to mention that there are just such a wide variety of services that are needed by human trafficking victims, and a lot of times the question that I hear is, we don't have specific services in our community that address human trafficking, so where would we, even if we identified the victims, where would we refer them to? And there's a lot of answers to that question, but just to give you a little preview of kind of some of the strategies that are discussed in the guide, I think that starting with the knowledge base that you already have in your community, oftentimes that can be, in the case of sex trafficking, that can be domestic violence service providers who may be already familiar with some of these dynamics, building on that and really identifying the players in your community that could build their capacity to address trafficking specifically. Because certainly there's a host of services that are needed, substance use treatment is one of them. Medical care, which Peter, is going to talk in more detail about. Housing is, of course, a huge piece of leaving the life, and just basic needs as well. And I think overarching, and you'll see this in more detail in the guide, but overarching all of that is this idea of providing trauma-informed care that is really informed in terms of the victimization pieces that go along with human trafficking and sex trafficking. So I think I'll stop there, but we're certainly excited and glad to have this guide and hope that it can be used in a very practical way for many of you.
So I had the opportunity to play 2 roles in development of the handbook, of the guide. One was to write a chapter on the Affordable Care Act and its implications for human trafficking, for victims of human trafficking, which can be quite considerable. And the second was to represent the NACOM Publications Committee, Communications Committee, and bring the perspective of our perspective of court administrators, and will this publication and how will it meet our needs. And so let me just publicly thank on behalf of that NACOM committee, the Human Trafficking Collaborative, John Martin, who really drove the whole process, SJI, and the 14 authors. I counted them this morning. There were 14 authors involved in this, which says something about the complexity, I think, of this problem. Secondly, I think the word guide is a misnomer. It's really more what I would call a comprehensive handbook, or an electronic publication with hot links at many different levels. So there's a lot of rich information here, that can be used, and we hope you'll find it helpful. Ernie Friesen is here. He happens to be one of my mentors in court administration. I can go back to his presentation a couple days ago about court administration. I think it plays an important role here, and that is understanding the environments that the court is operating in, always changing, and this is one of them. And the idea of collaboration and the importance of collaboration, which also appears here. So I'd like to take just maybe 3 minutes and talk about the process we used in our court on one of these 3 issues. The 3 issues I'm thinking of are immigration, which John had been spearheading over the past few years, Affordable Care Act, and of course, human trafficking. They all have 3 things in common. Highly controversial issues, politically controversial, and we talked about that maybe human trafficking is not quite as controversial, but maybe getting there. Highly complex issues, gets back to what I learned from Ernie about maybe courts are the most complex institution we have in society. And then thirdly, multiple governmental levels involved in these issues. So what we did, I'm going to just talk about what we did in Affordable Care Act, because I think it's the same process that we could take in our courts on moving forward with human trafficking. First, we educated ourselves. We literally brought in some people from the community who met in the presiding judge's chambers. Then we brought them in to meet with our supervising judges. As soon as we realized for the Affordable Care Act, and it could be the same for human trafficking, as soon as the green light went on that this is something we should be paying attention to, we went and got some funding from the Chicago Community Trust, $50,000, and we said we want to plan for the next year. It's now going in its 3rd year. And we brought together, we cast, as you do every day, we cast a very wide net in our moving forward with this issue. And in the well of the court of the presiding judge for the past 2.5 years, we had at least monthly meetings with at least 24 people sitting around talking about, for us it was the Affordable Care Act, and understanding it and how we could do three things, how the court could do three things. One, play a leadership role in policy, because it's still being developed, how they could also facilitate the process, and then thirdly, what does it mean for case management in our court to have this issue? And that's what we focused on for a couple years. In that 24-person square we had, this should be familiar to you all, we had healthcare leaders, we had people, the president of our county hospital, $500 million a year of unfunded medical care that hospital had before the Affordable Care Act. We had the sheriff, we had someone from the governor's cabinet who wrote a beautiful policy paper. We had the State Department of Corrections, we had the hospital at the Cook County Court involved, we had probation, all those players that you deal with every day. And I think that's, so what did we accomplish? And I hope we can do this with human trafficking also. We influence policy, literally benefits for criminal justice involved individuals who needed mental health care and drug treatment. The policy was changed in our state based on what we learned from these meetings over two and a half years. We developed a collaborative model that was working, and we took action. We really we enrolled 80,000 people in Illinois in Medicaid expansion. 4,000 of them came from our jail. So we have 10,000 people sitting in jail. 90% of them did not have health insurance before the Affordable Care Act. And then we developed a special court called an ACT court. And we call it a Getting Ready for Affordable Care Act court, where we literally take high-risk felons with drug involvement, 1 foot in the Illinois Department of Corrections, and we've made a commitment to reduce the number of commitments to the Illinois Department of Corrections by 25% over the next couple of years. So, you know, that's a different issue, but I think the process is very similar, and Ernie was talking about how important process is. So let me leave it at that, and I think we have a few minutes left, right, John?
Yeah, let's take, if you've got any specific questions. I think you got some sense of the rationale behind the guide. You like Peter's, where you're trying to recognize that you really are on this issue, like the Affordable Care Act, in human trafficking, you are going to be part of broader discussions, and to give you some of the tools to more effectively part of those broader discussions. And there's a lot of details there. We go through what all the different ways that people think about human trafficking and what the assumptions are, what the tools people are using in these other approaches. You know, I mean, we try to go in, we try to give you enough depth and detail within the document, and then as Peter points out, where you're able to link to a whole lot of other, you know, the beauty of the electronic things, you can really link out into the world. You just got to be directed to the right thing, so you're not wandering around doing massive Google searches, things like that. Any specific questions that you have as you're sitting here about human trafficking in general, about the guide? Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, you're in Nogales, okay. Yeah, okay, so from southern Arizona here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Recently, as you, most of you know, we have had children being taken to our city, which is Nogales, that are coming across the border. What impact have you identified to local courts that these children or these actions by the federal government, or the children coming in
Okay.
by themselves, what impact to local courts have you identified?
Okay.
That's
I have a very nice memo that David Slayton and he's got it right there. You got the most recent draft? Yeah, he's reviewing it. I'm being funny, but the reality is that we're working on this very specifically right now. But let me give you the general answer. Okay, the background here. There is no single more vulnerable population to human trafficking that you can identify, giving all the indicators, and they're all in here, than unaccompanied children from foreign countries, right? I mean, think about it. 12, 13-year-olds coming with, they don't know the language, they don't know the culture, they have maybe no family, and so forth and so on. So it's a really big deal. Couple things that we're working in tandem with. The White House and others, through Jonathan's good efforts, we finally introduced that there is a state court system, and the federal government's thinking on occasion. We're working with a lot of the federal agencies, and I'm not going to go into them, ORR, the refugee folks, and so forth and so on, to say, look, here's how what you all think you're doing with unaccompanied children from other countries, here's what you think you're doing is going to have an effect, and here's what it really means for the state courts. Here's what it really means for your delinquency proceedings. Here's what it really means. There's lots of federal protections. These are all in the guidebook for trafficking victims, for immigrants, special immigrant juvenile status, all kinds of federal protections. But a lot of those protections are dependent on findings from a state court. So we try and work with them to say, here's how it merges together. We try to make it clear that here's the kinds of services those kids are going to need, and here's the continuum of services, and how do you do that through some of the things you're doing through the federal organizations, and oops, what happens when those federal protections get to a certain point and it becomes part of the state court process? Are the same resources they need going to be there? So the very practical issues, as well as the bigger issue of being able to better identify victims and then try to coordinate that with what's going on with the state. That's the broad answer. The more specific answer is, right now, CCJ Costco, they're going to be talking about this on Sunday. So your chief, your state court administrator from Arizona, along with Texas and some of the others, and we're going to do some more conversation these next few days, and then make sure we link all that up with what the federal people are thinking. Okay, so it's everything from making people aware of the vulnerability of that population to trying to figure out where the intersection is with the state courts and what you can do about it. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
This is a really serious issue that all of you need to know about. It's very late breaking, and it's very difficult to understand, which is the reason why I'm glad the collaborative is helping us on this. Once CCJ and Costco look at this next week, I'll be putting in a request as a NACM board member to make sure this information gets out to the NACM membership, because it will affect your trial courts. So stay tuned as basically the answer in the next week or two. Hopefully we'll put out something from the collaborative that's kind of received the blessing of the chief justices and the state court administrators. But it's something you all should pay very close attention to. It won't just be the border states that will be affected. It's likely that courts all across the country will be affected. So you just need to, I don't know that we can tell you the exact answers right now, but you just need to stay tuned, because this is going to have an impact really everywhere.
Yeah, and it's a tough one, and again, David's point about it's not just the border states, but it's throughout the country that, you know, in the immigration arena, it's infinitely more complicated just because of the weirdness of the misalignment between immigration law and state law. But we got a lot of stuff on that. We got chapters in here. We've got another website dedicated to immigration, and you'll have access to all of that. We'll include it in the stuff that David's talking about, the synthesis of it. Because one thing, most of you, I've known some of you for, some people 40 years, so which is John Greason I'm looking at. It's a little embarrassing, but I have to say, I never get up in the morning and think the work I'm doing is irrelevant, right? At this point in my life, I feel like it's pretty relevant, and this is a good example of that. So sometimes the answers aren't as good as I'd want, but honestly, we're creating as we go along. And that's just the way it is in human trafficking, immigration, some of these other areas. It's evolving so rapidly, we are reduced to trying to make sure we can get you something in a week. But that's built on a lot of work that's been done for 5-6 years. Other questions on human trafficking? Yeah. Yeah.
If I'm understanding your definition, any legal prostitution still kind of holds that moniker of prostitution. Everything else is now under the terminology of human trafficking.
Now, you can use prostitution if you want. Legal prostitution, you know, let's face it, we're only talking about, what, 12 counties in the United States and Nevada? So there is prostitution, you know, we don't want to get into this. You can go, and there's a ton of stuff in the guide. We'll get you to all the resources you want to go, more than you want to go to find out, on the whole debate about can there be prostitution that isn't coerced, those kinds of issues. And we don't need to get into that debate, but I would not just consider that it's a change of terminology. I think people become much more sophisticated about the methods of recruitment, power, and control, one. Two, prostitution today, the market economy and the way prostitution today works, sure, we've got pimp-controlled small-time prostitution, but we have much more extensive, much more massive, much more organized, much more profitable, frankly, much more complicated forms of sex trafficking, of which some parts of prostitution are included. Prostitution anymore, again, pornography production is often part of that. The relationship between gentlemen's clubs, or whatever you want to call them, and how that all starts to get mixed in with coercion and these kinds of things. That's stuff we cover, and that's why it starts to get so complicated. The other thing to think about here is that the big shift you have to make is think of people as a commodity, and their value is as a commodity. Their value isn't as a human being. Maybe I'm spending too much time in this arena, but you know, trying to shift your thinking a little bit to think about people as a commodity, and that there's markets and there's consumers of that commodity. You have to do that on occasion, and that's the sex trafficking arena as well. These aren't kids we're talking about a commodity with a shelf life and so forth and so on. And that's the way that people involved in the human trafficking industry think about human beings. And it's a hard adjustment to make, you know what I'm saying? It's beyond some of our conceptual ways of the past. Go ahead.
And I would just add really briefly that, you know, regardless of whether it's legal or, you know, in that small number of jurisdictions, a lot of times, and, you know, John kind of mentioned whether it's pimp controlled or, you know, in some cases maybe it's by choice or there's more autonomy, but a lot of times underlying that is victimization and trauma. So it may be that, you know, if someone's not in pimp-controlled prostitution, but perhaps they have a history of sexual abuse as a child, or perhaps, you know, there are oftentimes reasons that they've entered the life, even if they aren't currently pimp-controlled or currently meet the definition of trafficking. So a lot of times it's looking at how can we use that past history and respond in a way that addresses trauma, you know, that will help them avoid trafficking situations in the future or avoid recidivism, things like that.
Let me emphasize again that some of those dynamics in labor trafficking, we haven't spent any time on labor trafficking, we never have enough time, but in the labor trafficking arena, there's all these other dynamics as well. So there's the shame. The shame's even more reinforced, right, in labor trafficking sometimes than it is in prostitution. That I've lost my manhood because I'm being trafficked to work in a field in the Central Valley in California or whatever. So all these dynamics are there as well. And the trauma, the methods of control, the exposure to risky chemicals, and on and on and on. So that's all part of that as well. We didn't get a chance to talk about labor trafficking and how you're going to see that in your courts. It's totally different often than the way you see some of these other things.
Yes, John, when we talk about screening and the court's responsibility to help identify victims of trafficking, regardless of what type it is, can you expand on that a little bit in terms of what exactly, as much as you can, does screening look like? I mean, what questions, what probing should be done? How should it be done to help identify?
Okay. And I'll let Katie, I'm going to buy 20 seconds for her to think of the appropriate response. But I'll tell you flat out, the screening, the risk and needs assessment tools, all this stuff that we've developed over the years, they just don't cut it. We're trying to figure out how to really get, because of the trauma-based factors and some of the other things, we're really trying to get a lot better at, one, real effective screening and triage on a superficial level, just to get some sense if there's something we should probe for more in greater detail. And that's sort of where things are going. But there are tools that are being developed. But when, where, how, and by whom, that's all a big deal right now, trying to figure out how you do that. When, where, how, by whom, and you can take it from there.
Sure, yeah, and I think that to your point about the court's responsibility and who should be screening, we've gotten questions a lot of times from judges who are very interested in this issue and think, but should it be the judge? Probably not. And there's actually a chapter on judicial ethics in this area. But it may be just identifying that there are red flags or things that make you think you want to link this person to a community provider who's able to provide that more in-depth screening, who have social workers on staff that are able to build rapport and trust, because again, this person may have a severe distrust of systems. So having someone who can really give them, is trained and can give them that attention and the ability to trust them will be really important. And I think as far as the actual content of questions, I'm happy to, you can contact us through the HT Courts website. I have business cards here, but we're happy to share the example assessment that I mentioned from Midtown Manhattan. But oftentimes the questions are just about a person's lack of control over their own life, and that could be over important documents, that could be over their movement. I mean, some of these things that John mentioned, but really probing for, you're not going to ask someone, have you been a victim of trafficking? Because that's not the language that really resonates. It's more about, do you have control of your passport, or are you able to move freely? What do you do with your income, from when you're working? What happens to your income at the end of the night? So questions that are more about a person's control or lack thereof over their own life may be probative, along with the questions about victimization and sexual assault and things like that.
And we should add that we're putting together courses just on that topic alone, for example, on what that assessment would look like. Jonathan, this is part of a bigger, longer-term initiative that includes, this is one tiny piece of a lot of technical assistance, developing trainings, and all these kinds of things that are all available. So contact us if you have any questions. We're running out of time here. But, this isn't going to go away. It's just like unaccompanied minors on the border. That's going to be something we're dealing with for a few years. This one the same way. And we appreciate the opportunity we're very pleased, honestly, to get the guide to you in time. So go home and look at it in detail. If you got any questions, let us know. Go to the website. But you know what it looks like, and we hope we've increased your interest in it. Thanks.